It was the early 1800s, before roads cut through the hills and before towns rose from the wilderness. There was only the land, and the land had grown barren. The backwoods were once a place of abundance, where soil turned seed into harvest, and streams carried fish that shimmered silver in the sun. Families lived scattered across valleys, hidden in hollows, surviving by what the earth could give. But then the hunger came. A bitter famine swept through the region, a slow and cruel blight that did not strike in one sudden wave, but crept, season by season, year by year. The first sign was small, the corn sprouting weak, the stalks pale. Then came the rot that spread across pumpkins and squash like a sickness of the soil. The rains grew erratic, and when they fell, they drowned what little would grow. When they withheld, the ground cracked open like a wound. The animals fared no better. Cattle dwindled to skin and bone before collapsing in fields of dead grass. Chickens vanished, taken by foxes as farmers no longer had the strength to guard their coops. Even the forests grew quiet, deer thinning out as if they too had heard the whisper of famine and fled to some unseen refuge. By the time the rivers slowed to trickles, carrying no fish, silence had settled upon the valley like a funeral shroud. It was within this silence that one family endured. Their home stood at the edge of the woods, a weather-beaten house built from the same trees that now stood lifeless around it. Its walls groaned in the wind, its roof bowed under rain, but it sheltered them still. Inside, the family clung to what remained. At first, they stretched out their meager stores with creativity. Roots dug from frozen ground, bark stripped from trees, broth made from boiled leather belts and weeds. All were tried, all were swallowed. Hunger twisted the stomach, and desperation taught the body to accept even the bitter and the vile. But starvation is not only of the body. It is of the mind, and it has a voice. It whispers first as a dull ache, then as a gnawing call, and finally as a roar that drowns out all else. In that hollow silence of the famine, its voice grew louder each day. The children's ribs showed through their skin, their eyes dimmed. The parents watched their strength fail, their hands trembling as they tried to split wood or carry water. One by one, the weakest among them began to falter. When the first of them died, there was mourning. The body was laid out, wrapped in cloth. Prayers whispered in voices too weak to carry. The earth was too frozen for a grave, so the family kept the dead in the shed, intending to bury them when the ground thawed. But the days stretched on, and food grew thinner, and the hunger's voice grew deafening. It was the patriarch who first gave words to the thought that none dared speak. To bury the dead was to waste what remained. To consume would be to survive. His words hung in the air, foul and blasphemous, but undeniable. Survival had no mercy, and famine had no patience for sanctity. The choice was made. At first it was done with trembling hands and lowered eyes. The body was cut in silence, every sound of the blade sickening in the stillness. Flesh, boiled and salted as best they could, was consumed without prayer or thanks, for none knew whether to call it salvation or damnation. Yet when the meat filled their bellies, when strength returned even for a fleeting moment, something shifted. The act, abhorrent as it was, had spared them another day. And in famine, another day was everything. It was survival at first, but soon it became something more. With the second death, there was less hesitation. The body was not mourned long, for sorrow could not outweigh hunger. This time, the meat was portioned with care, divided among the family so that none would be denied. Bones were cracked for marrow, skin boiled into broth, nothing was wasted. By the third, there was ritual. The patriarch spoke before the carving, not of death, but of gift. He told the family that the one who perished had given themselves in service of the living, that their flesh was not merely sustenance, but an offering. Heads were bowed before the meal, not in shame, but in reverence. Children were told that this was how the family would endure, how they would honor their own by carrying them forward within. The silence that had once been shameful became sacred. Season after season, the famine held, and the family persisted in their dark practice. Outsiders passed by less often, but when a lost traveler wandered into their woods, the family welcomed them with warmth. A fire was offered, a bed of straw to sleep on. When morning came, the traveler did not rise, and the family once again gathered at the table, heads bowed, speaking words of gratitude. As years passed, the famine eased. Crops returned, game crept back into the forest. Rivers began to swell once more. For others, life resumed. But for the family and the weather-beaten house, something irreversible had taken root. They had eaten of the dead not once, not twice, but enough to weave the act into the fabric of who they were. Survival had birthed a tradition. Children raised in the house were taught to view flesh as more than flesh. It was inheritance. It was communion. It was the binding of family to family, blood to blood, life to death. What had begun in desperation hardened into ritual, and what had been done in silence became spoken of in whispers as sacred duty. Though the famine ended, the practice did not. It endured like the house itself, weathered but unyielding. The family continued to live as neighbors among others, planting their fields and tending their stock, but within their walls the feast remained. And so it was that famine, cruel and merciless, gave birth to something far more enduring. Hunger had not only shaped their bodies, it had carved their souls. What had been survival was now tradition. What had been horror was now heritage. The roots of the family were no longer sunk in soil alone, but in flesh. And from those roots an endless hunger grew. The first time had been clumsy, desperate, and drenched in shame. The second time had been quicker, less hesitant, their hunger carving away their doubt. But by the third, something within the family began to shift. What had begun as mere survival was taking shape into something that felt older than words, older than conscience itself. It was the patriarch who sensed it first. He saw how the children no longer wept when flesh was prepared, how their eyes did not avert when the knife descended. They no longer flinched at the sound of bones breaking or the sight of marrow smeared on bread. Instead, they waited, lips dry, for their portion. Hunger had erased disgust. But hunger was not the only thing at work. One evening, when another body lay cooling in the shed, he called them all to the table before the carving. He did not lift his hands in prayer to God, for he knew the church would never bless what they had done. Instead, he spoke in a low voice, words that seemed to rise from the silence rather than from his own throat. "This is no sin," he told them. "This is gift. Flesh for flesh, life for life. What is taken is not wasted. What is consumed is carried forward. The dead do not vanish, they endure within us." It was not scripture, but it became law. That night, when the meat was laid upon the table, no one reached for it at once. Instead, they bowed their heads, a gesture of reverence, though none would have called it prayer. In that moment of silence, something sacred was born. A ritual, fragile at first, but already powerful. The feast had begun. The body was portioned carefully, more carefully than before. Cuts were deliberate, measured, divided evenly among those present. The children received smaller shares, not because their worth was less, but because they were not yet strong enough to bear too much. The patriarch took the first bite, not in greed, but in leadership, showing the others that there was no shame left. The family ate slowly, reverently. Each bite was chewed with silence, each swallow heavy with meaning. The flesh was no longer a thing to be hurried down with eyes closed, it was to be received. They told themselves that they honored the one who had given their body to sustain the living. The air thickened, not with the stench of death, but with the weight of tradition beginning to take root. When the meal was done, bones were set aside with care. Nothing would be wasted. Marrow would be cracked tomorrow, broth boiled the next day. The skin would be dried and used, the fat rendered for cooking. Every fragment was useful. In this there was not just necessity, but respect. To waste would be dishonor. And so the ritual deepened. Seasons passed, and famine clung to the land like a curse. With each new body, the ritual grew. By the fourth time, heads were bowed before knives were drawn. By the fifth, words of thanks were spoken in whispers, not to God, but to the flesh itself. The children, too young to remember the days of shame, knew only the ceremony. To them, it was not horror, but heritage. The patriarch gave the act structure. He decreed that before every feast, silence would fall across the table. In that silence, each would remember that their life was owed to the body before them. Then, and only then, could the carving begin. The matriarch, too, left her mark upon the ritual. It was she who began to salt strips of meat, preserving them so that the gift might last beyond one night. She lined them neatly, speaking of how the dead would linger with them, day after day, long after the flesh had cooled. The cellar became more than storage. It became a shrine of survival, where jars and hooks whispered of sacrifices made. By the second year of famine, their ritual was indistinguishable from religion. The children recited words before meals, taught to say them as though they had always existed. What we take, we carry. What is given, we keep. Flesh to flesh, blood to blood, we endure. They did not know when those words had first been spoken, or by whom. It felt older than the house, older than hunger itself, and perhaps it was. For rituals, once born, have a way of surviving long beyond the moment that created them. Yet, outside their walls, the world still lived in ignorance. Other families still struggled with hunger, still prayed for rain, still clung to their faith in God and the soil. If they suspected what their neighbors in the weather-beaten house were doing, they did not say it aloud. Suspicion is a dangerous thing in a time of famine. It can lead to violence, to envy, to exile. And so the house remained undisturbed, its rituals hidden beneath a mask of ordinary struggle. Inside, though, there was no mask left. The family had found something that bound them together more tightly than any sermon, more deeply than any meal of corn or bread. Flesh was communion. Flesh was continuity. Flesh was family. It was not long before the patriarch began to speak of the feast as destiny rather than desperation. He told the children that famine had been sent to them as a trial, and that they alone had passed it. Where others weakened, they had grown strong. Where others clung to empty prayers, they had found a truth carved in marrow and blood. The family listened. They believed. For hunger had taught them that belief was as nourishing as food itself. When famine finally loosened its grip, when crops returned to the fields and animals once again roamed the forests, the family did not stop. By then, the ritual had sunk too deep. The feast had become identity. The famine had ended, but the hunger was eternal. And so, long after the world around them returned to normal, the family's table remained the same. Heads bowed, knives sharpened, words whispered, silence held. Flesh portioned, consumed, honored. The ritual was no longer about survival. It was about tradition. It was about carrying forward what famine had birthed in them. And though they never spoke of it to outsiders, though they masked their true meals with bread and broth when neighbors came calling, the truth was this. The feast was now as fixed as the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. What had begun in fear had become faith. The first ritual was not the last. It was the beginning of something far larger, something that would endure through centuries, passed from one generation to the next like an heirloom of bone and blood. The famine had given them hunger, the hunger had given them ritual, and the ritual had given them eternity. The famine ended, but the family did not forget. Seasons softened, rains returned, and fields grew green once more. Livestock wandered again through pastures that had been barren, and smoke curled from chimneys with the comforting scent of bread instead of bone. Neighbors rejoiced, praising God for their deliverance, speaking of endurance and mercy. But for the family in the weather-beaten house, deliverance had not come from rain or God. It had come from flesh. The children who had been raised on the feast did not view it as a dark memory to be buried with the famine. For them, it was life itself. They had learned their letters by candlelight, while strips of salted meat dried on hooks overhead. They had grown strong, while others grew weak, because they had accepted the gifts the feast provided. To them, the ritual was not something strange, nor sinful. It was natural. It was heritage. And when those children grew older, when they had children of their own, they passed the same knowledge down. Bloodlines are not only carried in veins, but in tradition. Each new generation was born into the feast as though it were their birthright. The ritual was explained not as horror, but as honor. They were told that the famine had revealed a truth older than the hills themselves, a truth that their family alone had been strong enough to embrace. What is taken is carried. What is given is kept. Flesh to flesh, blood to blood, we endure. Those words, whispered in the silence before meals, became as familiar to the children as their own names. They recited them before they could walk. They bowed their heads before they understood why. They grew up believing the cellar was a sacred place, that the hooks and jars and salted strips were not grotesque but holy. And so, what began as survival hardened into inheritance. The world outside their home marched forward. Roads were carved through the hills. Towns grew from crossroads. Churches spread their bells across the valleys. People traveled farther, built bigger, dreamed beyond the hunger that had once chained them. But the family did not change. Their house aged but endured, and within its walls time moved differently. Children learned to plow and sow, to mend fences and tend animals, but they also learned how to prepare flesh in secret, how to hide bones where no curious eye would stumble upon them. They learned how to wear masks, smiling politely to neighbors while holding the truth in silence. It became an art, this balance between normalcy and inheritance. The family grew skilled in seeming ordinary, blending into the church pews, the schoolhouse benches, the market stalls. No one questioned them. No one saw the truth. And beneath the surface, the ritual lived on. As decades passed, the cellar grew crowded with memory. Generations of hooks bore generations of offerings. Bones were buried beneath the earth until the soil itself seemed to hum with their presence. The family said it was as if the ground beneath the house had become consecrated, heavy with the weight of what had been consumed there. When a child came of age, they were led into the cellar. The lantern light flickered across jars of rendered fat, across scarred tables and the swaying hooks. They were told the story of the famine, of how their ancestors had endured where others had perished. They were told that this was not shame, but strength, that they carried within them the proof that their family was chosen to endure forever. For some, the sight filled them with pride, for others with fear. But choice was an illusion. To be born into the family was to inherit its hunger, and hunger allowed no disobedience. On rare occasions, a child resisted. Some whispered that they could not stomach the ritual, that the act was too foul to continue. But tradition is heavier than conscience. Those who resisted were reminded that family is bound not by will, but by blood. In time, even the doubters bowed their heads at the table. Some did so reluctantly, with trembling hands. Others did so zealously, embracing the feast with fervor, declaring it the only truth. But all obeyed, for obedience was survival. And survival was everything. The family learned to adapt to the times. When suspicion grew in nearby towns after a disappearance, they grew cautious. No longer did they prey often upon travelers. Instead, they looked inward. A death within the family was never truly a loss, but a continuation of tradition. The body of a grandmother, a cousin, an uncle, these were not laid in the ground, but prepared in reverence. Outsiders were only taken when caution allowed. A drifter on a back road, a beggar no one would miss. Always carefully chosen, always carefully concealed. Neighbors never questioned why the family's smoke smelled strange, or why their cellar seemed always full, even when crops had failed again. If they suspected, they kept it to whispers. And so the family endured. By the time the first roads reached their valley, their rituals were already a century old. By the time railroads snaked through distant towns, their cellar had held countless offerings. By the time the world beyond them spoke of industry and progress, their house still stood, weathered and silent, a monument to famine's legacy. Bloodlines stretched across generations, each child born into the feast as naturally as they were born into the world. Each was taught that they carried not only the blood of their ancestors, but their flesh as well. To eat was to inherit, to consume was to continue. And though the world changed around them, the family's truth did not. It is said that hunger leaves marks deeper than scars. It imprints itself upon the soul, altering not just the body but the mind. For this family, hunger became identity. They were no longer merely survivors of famine, they were its chosen inheritors. Their children's children never knew a world without the feast. To them, it was as natural as planting in spring or harvesting in fall. It was the rhythm of their lives, steady, unbroken, eternal. And so the bloodline endured. Each generation carried forward the ritual, sharpening it, refining it, making it both secret and sacred. Outsiders saw only smiles and handshakes, church pews and Sunday best. But within the house, behind closed doors and beneath the floorboards, the true inheritance was passed down, bone, blood, and flesh. The famine had ended long ago, but its voice still whispered through the generations, carried not in memory, but in ritual. The hunger never left. It became them, and the bloodline would never break. The homestead was more than timber and stone. It was not just a place where the family slept, nor simply walls to keep out the wind. With each generation, it became something greater, an extension of the family itself. As though the house had absorbed the lives, the rituals, and the secrets carried out within its rooms. It stood at the edge of the woods, a hulking relic of another century. Its boards, darkened by time and weather, bore the stains of storms long past. Its roof sagged in places, patched with whatever wood could be scavenged. The windows, with their uneven glass panes, glimmered faintly in the light of dawn, yet always seemed to watch rather than reflect. Neighbors thought it an ordinary structure, old but serviceable, but those who lived within knew differently. The house had become a vault, a keeper of secrets, and a witness to every ritual the family had performed since famine's first whispers. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. On stormy nights, when wind howled through the trees, the boards groaned and cracked as though they were straining against memory. In winter, frost spread across the windows in jagged patterns, curling like veins, as if the house itself carried blood beneath its skin. When fires roared in the hearth, the smoke clung not only to the chimney but to the very walls, seeping into every crack until the air was thick with the smell of ash and something faintly metallic. The floors bore their own scars. Generations of boots had worn paths across them, darkened planks where the family's feet always fell, as if their movements were guided by something older than habit. Beneath the kitchen table, where the family gathered for the feast, the wood had deepened in color from countless spills. Broth, marrow, grease, each stain layering atop the last, until the very grain of the wood seemed to pulse with memory. But it was what lay beneath the floors that mattered most. The cellar was the house's heart, though no outsider ever saw it. Narrow stairs creaked underfoot, leading down into damp air heavy with salt and smoke. The lantern light barely pierced the darkness, glinting off hooks suspended from beams overhead. These hooks had borne countless offerings, their steel darkened with rust and older stains that no scrubbing could erase. Along the walls, shelves bowed under the weight of jars. Some held pale fat, congealed and preserved. Others were filled with dried strips, salted and hung in neat rows. The smell lingered, thick, acrid, unmistakable. It clung to the stones, to the earth itself. Even when the cellar was empty, the air never lost that scent. The table at the center bore deep grooves from knives and cleavers. Its surface was a map of scars, each line carved by generations of hands preparing the feast. Families might pass down heirlooms of silver or gold. This family passed down the table, its wood darkened by years of blood and smoke. The children were told that the cellar was sacred. They were led down its steps as though into a chapel, taught to bow their heads before the hooks and jars. They learned that the cellar was not merely storage, but sanctuary. It was the place where their inheritance lived, where their bloodline's survival was written not in ink, but in bone. Even the earth beneath the house had grown complicit. For centuries, bones had been buried in shallow pits under its foundation, layer upon layer of remains hidden from the eyes of the world. The soil was seeded with marrow, enriched not by crops, but by bodies. The family said the ground had grown heavy with memory, that if you pressed your ear against it, you could almost hear the whispers of those who had been consumed. The house itself seemed to know. Its beams and rafters groaned not only from age, but from the weight of all it had witnessed. The homestead had soaked up centuries of rituals until it was no longer neutral. It was a participant. It held the silence during the prayers. It carried the smoke of the feast into the air, and it sheltered the secrets that the family could never allow beyond its walls. To outsiders, it was only a house. To the family, it was a cathedral. As generations came and went, repairs were made, but always sparingly. The family never replaced the house entirely, never tore it down to rebuild anew. To do so would have been sacrilege, as though they would be tearing down the very body of their heritage. Instead, they patched, they mended, they propped up sagging beams and nailed fresh boards over rotting ones. They kept it standing, not because it was beautiful, but because it was holy. When storms battered the valley, other homes fell. Neighbors rebuilt, raising new walls, brighter windows, sturdier roofs. But the family's house endured. Its sagging shape became familiar, its silhouette etched against the horizon like a shadow that had always been there. To the world, it was simply old. To the family, it was eternal. Children grew within its walls, their laughter echoing in the same rooms where their ancestors had wept with hunger. They played in the loft while beneath them the cellar held its jars and hooks. They slept in beds that creaked with age, beneath ceilings stained with smoke, never questioning that this house was both cradle and coffin, protector and captor. The house shaped them. Its darkness became their comfort, its silence their language. Even when they stepped beyond its doors into the world of neighbors and churches, they carried the house with them like a second skin. It taught them to smile with restraint, to speak carefully, to hide what was sacred behind plain walls. And always, when they returned home, the house welcomed them back, swallowing their secrets whole. There were whispers among neighbors, of course. Murmurs of strange smells drifting from the chimney, of odd noises carried on the night wind. Hunters passing through the woods swore they had seen figures carrying something heavy down into the cellar. But suspicion faded quickly. The family was polite, after all. They came to gatherings, offered their hands in labor, donated to the church. Their house was old, yes, and its air heavy with age, but nothing more. No one outside truly believed the homestead was alive. No one thought its walls had absorbed centuries of hunger, that its cellar was a sanctum of flesh. To all but the family, it was simply a relic of the past, a house too stubborn to fall. But the truth was plain to those who lived within. The house was not only their shelter, it was their partner, it was their witness, it was their confessor. The family could not exist without it, and by now the house could not exist without them. Together they endured. For all the darkness that clung to the homestead, daylight always demanded something different. The family had long ago learned that survival required more than flesh. It required secrecy, the kind that only deception could buy. To feed their rituals, they had to appear ordinary. So they wove themselves into the rhythm of the valley. The land around the house bore fields of corn and beans. Chickens scratched in the dirt. A cow grazed in the pasture. To the casual eye, it was no different from any other farm that had weathered time. Visitors passing on the road might see laundry strung between poles, shirts and linens flapping in the breeze. They might hear the distant sound of a child's laugh, or the steady creak of a rocking chair on the porch. All of it looked plain, expected. That was the genius of it. The family wore masks as carefully as any churchgoer donned Sunday best. The men tipped their hats to neighbors, offering strong backs when fences needed mending or when a storm knocked down a tree across a road. The women brought pies to church socials, their crusts golden and perfect, their smiles as practiced as their recipes. The children attended school, barefoot like the others, repeating their lessons in sing-song voices. Every gesture was studied, every word rehearsed. Normalcy was not natural to them. It was a performance passed down like a ritual, every bit as sacred as the prayers in the cellar. The neighbors, for their part, found little to question. The family was quiet, yes, but so were many who lived in the backwoods. Solitude was expected. Privacy was respected. People kept to their own business unless some offense forced otherwise. Still, stories sometimes slipped between cracks. Hunters spoke of strange cries carried through the trees at night, noises too human to belong to animals. Farmers claimed that smoke from the homestead's chimney carried a foul scent on certain nights, heavy and cloying, unlike wood or meat they knew. Children whispered of shadows moving through the yard long after lamps had gone out. But suspicion never hardened. When a child went missing from a neighboring farm, wolves were blamed. When a drifter disappeared on the road, it was assumed he had moved on. The backwoods swallowed many lives, and no one imagined that some were swallowed in a way far closer to home. The family knew how to soothe doubts. They greeted concern with sympathy. They joined search parties, their lanterns swinging through the woods as they called into the darkness for names they already knew would not answer. They stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors, feigning the same fear and sorrow, while at home their cellar shelves grew heavier. It was the children who bore the heaviest burden of performance. They were taught from infancy the rules of their world. Never speak of the feast. Never draw attention. Never betray the family's ways. They learned to smile at strangers, to laugh when expected, to mimic joy, though theirs was born in shadows. Some children struggled. Their eyes lingered too long on the jars in the cellar, or their stomachs turned at the smells that filled the house during the rituals. These children had to be corrected, sometimes gently, sometimes with a stern hand. Others took to the mask more easily, slipping into their roles as if they had been born to them, which in a sense they had. At night, around the long table, the children were reminded of their duty. They were told that the world beyond the homestead could never understand them, that the neighbors who smiled across fences would turn to fire and rope if the truth were ever known. The feast was survival, the cellar their sanctuary, and the mask of normalcy their shield. To betray any of these was to betray the bloodline itself. So the family became experts in blending. They allowed the seasons to guide their performance. In summer, they worked the fields with sweat-darkened shirts, their hands as calloused as any neighbor's. In autumn, they harvested, stacked firewood, and joined in community gatherings, their voices raised in hymns alongside the rest. At Christmas, they lit candles in their windows, sang carols, and exchanged small gifts, as though joy were truly theirs. Behind it all, the rituals continued. The feast was held on schedule, its timing as natural to them as planting and harvest. But no outsider ever glimpsed it. Not once in all the generations did a neighbor step into the cellar. Not once did anyone hear the prayers spoken in whispers too low for the wind to carry. This was the balance they struck. Ordinary by day, sacred by night. A family like any other until the door was closed. Sometimes the mask slipped, if only for a moment. A child might answer a question too oddly, speaking of things no outsider should know. A guest might notice a scar on a table, too deep and strange to have been carved by a kitchen knife. A neighbor might catch a whiff of smoke from the chimney that made their stomach twist. When that happened, the family acted quickly. They explained, they laughed, they distracted. And if a suspicion grew too strong, if someone began to look too closely, circumstances had a way of resolving themselves. An accident on the road, a fire in the woods, a sudden sickness. The family had learned that secrecy demanded not only masks, but sometimes silence. The homestead itself helped. Its age was its camouflage. The creaks of its floors, the groans of its beams, the flicker of its windows, all could be blamed on nothing more than time. Its smells could be excused as damp earth, old smoke, or game meat curing in the cellar. Its shadows were dismissed as tricks of the trees. And so the neighbors went on, unknowing. They waved from their porches, borrowed tools, shared seed, and passed by the homestead with little more than a second glance. The family smiled in return, their masks seamless, their secrets intact. Generations passed like this. Entire lives were lived under the double weight of ritual and pretense. Children grew into adults, took spouses, raised new generations, all while the homestead held its silence. Outwardly, the family's history was one of hard-working simplicity, no different from the other names carved into church pews and cemetery stones. The family smiled in return, their masks seamless, their secrets intact. Generations passed like this. Entire lives were lived under the double weight of ritual and pretense. Children grew into adults, took spouses, raised new generations, all while the homestead held its silence. Outwardly, the family's history was one of hard-working simplicity, no different from the other names carved into church pews and cemetery stones. Inwardly, their history was carved in bone, preserved in jars, whispered in cellars. This was their legacy, to be unseen, even when looked upon. To be ordinary, even when drenched in the extraordinary. To pass for neighbors while carrying forward something ancient and unspeakable. And for centuries it worked. The neighbors lived and died never knowing the truth. The family endured, their rituals uninterrupted. And the homestead, with its sagging roof and groaning beams, stood watch over them all, a mask of timber and stone that concealed a heart of hunger. Normalcy was their shield, secrecy was their salvation, and behind it all the feast waited, as it always had, patient and eternal. The cellar beneath the homestead was more than stone and timber. It was a chapel, a sanctuary, a place where hunger became holiness. Generations had shaped it into its current form. The floor, once raw earth, had been packed, smoothed, and hardened until it felt like bone beneath bare feet. The walls were lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of jars and vessels, each sealed tight with wax, each holding fragments of the family's lineage. Bones bleached pale, flesh dried dark, ash collected from fires long gone. All labeled, though the writing was so old that few alive could still read it. The air was thick, always damp, always tinged with the same heavy sweetness, half rot, half spice, that never left no matter how many candles were lit. And always, always, there was the table. It stood in the center, carved from oak blackened by years of smoke and blood. Every scratch, every groove told a story. It was there that the family gathered when the time came. And when the candles were lit and the cellar filled with their whispers, the house above seemed to fall silent, as if it too knew the sacredness of what was about to begin. The ritual feast did not follow the calendar of church or state. It was older than that. Its timing came from bloodlines, from cycles carried in the marrow of the family itself. Some feasts were small, meant only to honor the passing of a relative. Others were grand, marking the turning of seasons or the birth of a child destined to carry the tradition forward. But no matter the occasion, the pattern was always the same. First came the gathering. At dusk, the family descended into the cellar in silence. The younger ones walked last, their heads bowed, their eyes wide, their stomachs knotted with both fear and hunger. Each carried something, a candle, a knife, a vessel. Together they circled the table. Then came the offering. One of the elders would step forward, laying upon the wood what had been prepared. Sometimes it was a preserved remnant, drawn from the jars that lined the shelves. Other times it was fresher, wrapped in cloth still damp and warm. Prayers were spoken then, the same words whispered for centuries, phrases so old that their meaning had long been swallowed by the passage of time. Yet the rhythm mattered, the sound mattered. They believed the words carried the feast into the marrow of the bloodline, binding each generation to the last. The food was never presented as food. It was not to be eaten in the careless way neighbors tore bread or salted pork. No, here it was holy, consumed with reverence. The family sat in a circle, each taking only what was allotted. Fingers trembled as they passed the pieces, mouths whispered thanks as teeth tore through flesh. To them, it was not horror, it was communion. The children were always made to partake, no matter how small. The first bite was the hardest, always. Some wept, some gagged, some froze in terror until a stern hand pressed the morsel against their lips. But once swallowed, once the act was done, the child was never the same. They were bound now, initiated, their silence and loyalty sealed not by word, but by blood. Those who resisted for too long did not remain. The cellar held no place for the faithless. The feast was more than sustenance, it was memory. Elders told stories as they ate, stories of the famine that had begun it all, of ancestors who had survived by first breaking the taboo, of the pacts made in firelight and bone. Each tale reminded the family of who they were, what they owed, and why the mask of normalcy above ground mattered so dearly. Sometimes a name would be spoken, a neighbor, a traveler, a lost soul who had unwittingly become part of the lineage. These names were never mocked, never spoken with cruelty. They were folded into the ritual as honored guests. To consume was to honor, and to honor was to preserve. At least that was the story told to soothe uneasy hearts. When the eating was done, the remains were divided. Some went into jars, sealed and labeled, added to the shelves where they would outlast generations. Some were burned, the ashes mixed with herbs and scattered at the edges of the property, a ward against discovery. And some were buried in the earth beneath the cellar floor, feeding the soil from which the family's fields would grow. In this way, the family told themselves, nothing was wasted. All was returned. The candles burned low, the prayers grew softer, and finally the family ascended once more, their footsteps heavy but united. By the time they emerged into the world above, the night was still and silent, as though nothing had happened at all. To the family, the ritual feast was not a crime. It was survival made holy. It was the thread that stitched the centuries together. Without it, they would have withered long ago, just another forgotten family swallowed by famine and time. With it, they endured. Yet endurance came with cost. Each generation bore scars from the cellar. Some hid them well, passing through life with calm smiles and steady hands. Others faltered, their eyes haunted, their appetites too eager or too hesitant, their minds pulled taut between the mask above and the truth below. The cellar demanded balance, and not all could keep it. Still, the rituals continued. They always continued. For in the family's eyes, the feast was more than tradition. It was proof of their chosen nature, proof that they were different from the world around them.
Better, perhaps, stronger. Where others had starved, they had endured. Where others had died, they had lived. And in the cellar, with candles flickering against jars of flesh and bone, they reminded themselves again and again that endurance was the highest form of devotion. And so the ritual feast passed from generation to generation, as unbroken as the blood line itself. The world outside changed. Roads carved through forests, towns rose and fell, machines and lights spread across the land. But in the cellar beneath the weather-beaten homestead, the same prayers were whispered, the same table was set, the same flesh was consumed. To the family, time meant nothing. The feast was eternal. Each generation was born into the feast as surely as they were born into the world. The ritual was their lullaby, their education, their inheritance. But inheritance is not always gift. For many it was a burden, heavy and choking, a shadow that grew taller with every passing year. Children were taught early that their lives were not entirely their own. They belonged to the family, and the family belonged to the ritual. From their first breath they were bound to the cellar, even if they did not descend its stairs until later. And when they did, when they saw the jars lined up like soldiers, when they smelled the thick air of salt and smoke, when they watched their elders bow their heads and whisper the words, they understood. Some understood with pride. They lifted their chins, their eyes burning with zeal. To them it was an honor to belong to something older than the towns, older than the roads, older than the church itself. They felt chosen, strong, superior to neighbors who laughed and ate bread without ever knowing the truth of what survival truly meant. But not all were zealous. Others learned the ritual with trembling hands and unsettled hearts. They forced down their portions with dry throats. They whispered the prayers but felt no reverence, only dread. At night they dreamed of bones whispering beneath their beds, of eyes staring from cellar jars. They looked at their parents and wondered if love was real, or if it, too, was just another mask worn to preserve tradition. The bloodline bound them, but it did not make them equal. The eldest children bore the heaviest weight. They were groomed to lead the rituals one day, to memorize the words, to wield the knife with steady hand. Their mistakes were corrected harshly, for hesitation at the table was not permitted. Elders reminded them of famine's history, repeating again and again that only through devotion could the family endure. To falter was to dishonor not just oneself, but centuries of ancestors who had given flesh to sustain them. Younger siblings sometimes envied this burden, sometimes feared it. They were allowed hesitation, for a time, shielded by their youth. But they too would one day stand at the table, and when the blade was placed in their hand, no excuse would save them. It was the outsiders, the spouses brought in, who often carried the heaviest torment.
Rarely did one marry into the family without eventually being initiated. At first they might believe their new kin to be merely eccentric, unusually private, tied too tightly to their old traditions. But in time the truth could not be hidden. Some embraced it, eager to prove themselves worthy of belonging. Others recoiled, trapped between loyalty to their spouse and horror at what they had seen. But the family did not tolerate fracture. An outsider who resisted too long ceased to be an outsider at all. They became offering. In this way, the bloodline kept itself pure. Through the centuries, a strange balance emerged. The family's pride kept the ritual alive, But so did fear. Pride made them bow their heads with reverence. Fear kept them silent. Every child knew what it would mean to speak of the feast to neighbors. They were told that discovery would not bring justice, but annihilation. The outside world would burn their house, scatter their bones, erase their lineage from history. And so silence was survival, as sacred as the ritual itself. To betray the feast was to betray blood, and betrayal was unthinkable. Yet silence brought another cost: isolation. Children attended school, but they never truly belonged. They learned their letters alongside neighbors, but always felt apart, carrying knowledge no other child could imagine. They joined games, but laughter never reached their bones. They grew into adults who smiled politely, who nodded at sermons, who shook hands at markets, but always there was a distance in their eyes.
Even within the family, the burden could be suffocating. In whispers behind locked doors, some confessed to siblings or cousins that they longed to escape. They spoke of distant towns, of lives unshackled from the cellar. But longing was dangerous. More than one who dreamed too loudly had vanished, their absence explained away with muttered words of illness or travel. The truth lay beneath the cellar floor, in the earth seeded with generations of silence. The bloodline endured, not because every member embraced it, but because no one could leave. Family was cage as much as sanctuary. The rituals were both blessing and curse, heritage and sentence. The elders always reminded them. Famine had shaped them. Famine had chosen them. Where others had perished, they had lived. To abandon the ritual would be to spit upon the graves of those who had endured the first hunger. And so they stayed. They obeyed. Generation after generation, children grew into parents who raised new children, each carrying the same burden. The cycle spun on, unbroken, as though the bloodline itself were bound by iron chains to the cellar below. But iron rusts, and chains weaken. From time to time, cracks appeared. A child who cried too often during the feast. A young man who stared too long at the road leading out of the valley. A mother who whispered prayers not to the feast, but to God, asking for deliverance. These cracks never lasted long. They were corrected, silenced, or absorbed back into the ritual. But their presence was enough to show that not all who carried the blood carried it willingly. Still, the elders knew the truth. The burden could not break the bloodline. It was too deeply rooted, too tightly bound. For every child who resisted, another embraced with fervor. For every whisper of rebellion, there was a louder prayer of devotion. The feast was eternal, and the burden of bloodlines was eternal with it. Above ground, neighbors still waved from porches, smiled at church, exchanged gifts and greetings. They saw only a family like any other, bound by love, by heritage, by the weight of history. But within the weather-beaten house, in the cellar thick with smoke and salt, the truth pressed upon every generation like a stone upon the chest. Some carried it proudly, others carried it trembling, but all carried it. For that was the price of belonging to the bloodline of the feast. Beneath the weathered house lay a chamber that few in the world would ever see. A narrow stair, worn by centuries of footsteps, led downward into shadow. The steps creaked, each one groaning under the weight of generations. The air thickened as you descended, colder, damper, until it pressed against the lungs. And then you reached it, the cellar. It was not simply storage. It was not merely a basement where jars of beans and barrels of cider might rest. This was something older, something darker. The family called it the room below, but in truth it was their sanctuary, their reliquary, their museum of hunger. The first thing that struck any who entered was the smell. It was a smell that never left, no matter how often the candles burned or how thick the smoke curled from torches. Salt and smoke clung to the air, but beneath those notes was something heavier. The copper tang of blood, the sweetness of decay long past, the faint sourness of preserved fat. It was the perfume of centuries, layered until it became inseparable from the stones themselves.
The shelves ran along every wall, sagging under the weight of jars. Each jar was sealed with wax, their lids darkened, their glass fogged. Within them floated strips of dried flesh, pieces of bone, organs preserved in brine. Some jars were so old the contents had discolored into shadows, yet the family still kept them, as though to discard would be sacrilege. Each bore a mark, scratched or painted, denoting whose remains it held. Some marks were names. Others were symbols long since forgotten in meaning, known only as part of the lineage. Between the shelves stood racks of hooks. Iron, rust dark, they dangled like silent pendulums. Some were empty. Some bore drying strips of meat, curled and darkened, swaying gently when the air stirred. The hooks had been replaced over time, but always with iron, always with the same shape. To the family they were sacred instruments, not tools. At the center stood the table. Oak, scarred by centuries of knives. Its surface was a patchwork of grooves and stains. No matter how often it was scrubbed, the marks remained. They told the story of every feast, of every offering carved upon its surface. Some of the grooves were deep, carved by hesitation. Others were clean and sharp, made by steady, practiced hands. To the family they were sacred instruments, not tools. At the center stood the table. Oak, scarred by centuries of knives. Its surface was a patchwork of grooves and stains. No matter how often it was scrubbed, the marks remained. They told the story of every feast, of every offering carved upon its surface. Some of the grooves were deep, carved by hesitation. Others were clean and sharp, made by steady, practiced hands.
The table was more than furniture. It was an altar. Lanterns hung from beams, their light casting long, flickering shadows. The cellar seemed larger in shadow than it was in stone. Corners stretched into darkness, shelves seemed endless, and the hooks swayed like pendulums counting time. To a child, the cellar felt infinite, as though the further you stared, the more it grew. There were other things, too, relics, keepsakes, bones too significant to be ground or buried, skulls, polished smooth, stacked in careful pyramids, rib cages wired together and hung like grotesque chandeliers, finger bones strung on twine, rattling faintly whenever a draft passed through. Each relic was explained to the children during their initiation. This skull belonged to an ancestor who first spoke the prayers. That rib cage to a matriarch who preserved the feast through lean years. These bones were not refuse, they were scripture. At the far end of the cellar lay the pits, shallow hollows dug into the earth, filled and filled again across centuries. Here the less sacred remains were buried, shards of bone, ash from burned offerings, fragments too small to preserve. The earth drank it all. Over time, the soil grew black and heavy, thick with marrow. Some said the ground itself had become alive, humming faintly with the voices of those buried within. The children were told that if they pressed their ears to the dirt, they could hear whispers, promises, warnings, or blessings, depending on what they needed most.
Every generation was brought into the cellar when the time was right. No child was permitted entry until they had proven obedience, silence, and loyalty. When they descended those creaking steps for the first time, it was as though their childhood ended at once. Lantern light revealed the jars, the hooks, the table, and their eyes widened not only with horror, but with understanding. This was their inheritance. This was their truth. The elders would speak then, their voices low and steady. They would tell the story of famine, of hunger's cruelty, of the ancestors who had endured by discovering the feast. They would gesture to the jars as proof, each one a link in an unbroken chain of survival. Then the child would be handed their first portion, small but significant. To consume it in the cellar, beneath the eyes of ancestors preserved in glass, was to bind oneself to the bloodline forever. Some children wept, some gagged, some swallowed without hesitation. But none left the cellar unchanged. It was not only ritual that bound them to the cellar, it was fear. They were told from the moment of initiation that to betray the cellar was to betray the family, and betrayal could never be forgiven. The jars were watching, the bones were listening. The ancestors, preserved in salt and smoke, would not forgive those who broke the silence. The cellar was both sanctuary and prison, and its hold on the family was absolute. Over the years, stories circulated within the family of those who had faltered. A cousin who whispered doubts, a brother who dreamed of leaving, a mother who prayed too loudly to God instead of the feast. They all vanished. Their absence was never explained, but their presence was always felt, preserved in jars, buried in the earth, or hanging from hooks. The children knew without being told. To resist was to be absorbed. The cellar was eternal. Seasons changed above. Storms battered the house. Neighbors came and went, but the cellar never altered. Its air remained damp and heavy. Its shelves never emptied. Its table never clean. It was constant, unyielding, the heart that beat beneath the homestead. To outsiders, the house was old, sagging, ordinary. But to those within, the truth was clear. The homestead was a mask. The cellar was the face. And as long as the cellar endured, so too would the feast. The valley learned to ignore certain noises. It learned to treat strange smells as quirks of wind and weather, and to file disappearances under the wide heading of backwoods misfortune. But habits fray with time, and even the most obedient landscape cannot smother every whisper. Suspicions arrived in small, ordinary vessels. A conversation cut short in a shop aisle. A hunter's frown at odd markings on bone. The prickling sense, walking past the homestead at dusk, that the house watched with more than windows. Roads drew nearer. They brought peddlers with creaking wagons, then motorists who took wrong turns and slowed to ask directions, then hikers who followed deer paths because maps made promises the hills refused to keep. Some of these travelers reached the weather-beaten porch. Fewer departed by the same path. The valley, long practiced at swallowing, did what it had always done. It closed over. Neighbors held their rituals of denial. They waved from porches and asked after health and harvests, and when a story tried to deepen, when a voice wanted to mention the rumor of a drifter last seen taking a cup of water at the homestead fence, the talk turned instead to rain gauges and seed prices. The mind protects itself with weather. It shields itself with chores. Yet the uneasy facts did not vanish. They collected like ash in the corners. There were signs, tangible and sour. Smoke from the homestead chimney sometimes carried a sweetness that did not belong to applewood or ham. In winter, when the wind laid everything bare, the smell traveled farther. Dogs howled and then fell silent, as if corrected by instinct. A boy exploring the creek found a smooth white curve in the shallows, lifted it with both hands, and set it down again without speaking. He would not return to the creek for a year. A hunter knelt at the edge of a game path and examined a scatter of bones, cleanly scored where knives had once argued with sinew. He wrapped his unease in silence and walked on. The world beyond the valley noticed in its indifferent way. A newspaper column from a distant town listed a string of names: vagrants, a traveling preacher, a pair of out-of-state anglers, under the indifferent heading of unresolved. The column made no accusations. It offered only dates and last known locations, and it moved no hearts but those already inclined to worry. A deputy stared at the clipping and then at the road that turned to mud and shadow as it approached the homestead. He made notes that gathered dust in a desk drawer. The drawer stuck in damp weather and would not easily open again. Schools generated their own quiet warnings. A child from the Homestead family drew hooks in a corner of a page where other children sketched barns and horses. Another scribbled jars lined like soldiers on a shelf. circles for glass, darker circles for what floated within. A teacher closed the notebook and told herself that imagination wanders at that age. The children draw what they see because they lack the distance to choose otherwise. At lunch, the teacher sat in the sun a long time, warming her hands without realizing they had grown cold. On a spring day, floodwater rolled a shoulder of the hill and chewed at the slope behind the house. When the water sank back into the ground, it left a wound of black soil and pale fragments. The family hurried to dress the wound, tamping fresh earth into the cut with methodical care, their boots sinking to the ankle as though the soil recognized its keepers. A passerby saw only a family mending storm damage. He tipped his hat and went on, uneasy without knowing why. At the general store, the Homestead's purchases spoke a language no one volunteered to translate. Salt in heavy sacks, enough to rim a winter's roads. Wax by the pound, though no one in the family kept bees. Knives that dulled quickly and were just as quickly replaced. The ledger was loyal and did not gossip. The clerk wrapped each parcel with twine, tied neat square knots, and made pleasant remarks about the state of the fields. After closing, he thumbed the worn groove on the counter where the family's coins always landed and stared through the window at the road that pointed toward the hills. Search parties came when the valley's rituals of denial failed. Lanterns swung on loops of wire. Men and women moved in lines through the timber, calling names into a dark that answered with owls. The family joined as they always did, sure-footed and helpful, guiding others away from gullies and old wells. They were present in every photograph taken at the church before the search began, faces as open and unspectacular as fence posts. When the searches ended, and they always ended, the valley folded the names into the drawer of unattended grief and went back to chores. The deputy who studied the clipping came once more, this time at noon, with a map folded to show the homestead in the center like a target grown out of paper. He paced the road shoulder, measured wheel ruts with 2 fingers, knelt to consider the flattened grass near the ditch. The house on the hill did not stir, yet its presence felt like a weight on the skin. He wrote a line in his notebook. He did not mention his visit to anyone. He drove home with the window down as if to rinse a scent from the car he could not name. Weeks later, the deputy failed to report for a shift. The desk drawer with the notes stuck fast until autumn, when dry air let it slide open again. No one read what was inside. The pages curled at the edges as if they had tried to speak and tired of the effort. A reporter arrived in a year when gossip grew bold. He stayed at the valley's one boarding house and ate fried eggs, asking polite questions stitched together with string. He walked the road to the homestead, stopped at the fence, took notes on the house's lean and the way its chimney coughed as though clearing an old throat. He went no further. The story he filed described a place where tradition ran deeper than the creek bed, and where people minded their business with the ferocity of wildflowers clinging to rock. The editor cut it down to fit a corner, and placed it beside an advertisement for patent hair tonic. The reporter took another assignment and forgot how the wind had tasted. The homestead watched suspicion gather and slacken like fog. When rumors thickened, the family tightened its performance. Church attendance never lapsed. Pies baked and cooled on window sills where they could be seen. Laughter, measured and bright, traveled from the porch at the proper hours. The cellar below adapted too. Deeper pits dug, jars relabeled with care, ashes scattered farther along the property line, where the brush swallowed them without comment. The house received these adjustments as a body receives the slow changes of habit. Nothing about it looked different from the road. Sometimes the land itself seemed to protest. Foxes barked at the tree line and then fell quiet as though corrected.
Crows gathered on the fence in black notation, writing a score no one could play. A thunderstorm cracked directly over the house and split a dead oak cleanly as a bone. The stump bled sap for weeks and then stopped. The valley added these things to its drawer of unattended grief and returned to chores.
Children from neighboring farms told one another rules in the sing-song of secret clubs. Do not take a shortcut past the old place after sundown. Do not drink from the creek near the back field, even when the heat makes you dizzy. Do not wave if you see someone in the upstairs window, because no one lives in that room. No adult taught them these rules. They grew like mushrooms out of damp knowledge, and, like mushrooms, they were left untouched. The era changed its tools. Cameras crept into pockets. Satellites annotated maps with careless precision. Laboratories promised that even old bones could be coaxed into confessing their names. The family read the same newspapers as everyone else and took from them a renewed devotion to the old disciplines: patience, caution, the art of being unremarkable. Where the world sped up, the homestead leaned more deeply into stillness. Stillness, handled correctly, is a form of camouflage. On a late summer evening, when locusts sawed at the heat and the horizon dimmed into rust, smoke lifted from the chimney in a ribbon without odor. The house kept its thoughts. On the road below, a neighbor paused with a feed sack on one shoulder and watched the smoke straighten like a spine against the sky. He remembered a story his grandfather had told of a season when storms refused to break and men hardened in ways they never softened again. The neighbor shifted the feed sack and went on. He had animals to tend, chores to finish before dark. Suspicion does not milk a cow or mend a gate. So the valley learned yet again to ignore certain noises. It learned to treat strange smells as the work of wind. It filed disappearances under headings that made the ledger easier to close. And the homestead, with its practiced posture of weary survival, endured beneath the notices and rumors, beneath the occasional reporter's curiosity and the deputy's quiet notes, beneath the sharp, bright knowledge children sometimes carry without understanding. The cellar below held steady. The shelves did not list farther. The jars did not cloud more than they always had. The pits remained covered as neatly as beds. The table kept its scars. Suspicion circled like a hawk that cannot quite fix a field mouse against the ground. It hung, it drifted, it returned, it left. And the family, heads inclined at the right moments, hands dirtied with ordinary work, moved from season to season with the patience of stone. No one who stayed the night was seen again. The valley looked away. The house did not. The famine was long ago. The neighbors who lived through it are dust. The towns that once whispered about the valley have risen, fallen, and risen again. The world has spun forward into new eras, new inventions, new hungers. But in the weather-beaten house at the edge of the woods, nothing has changed. The homestead still stands. Its roof bows but does not collapse. Its beams groan but do not break. Rain slides down its sides, wind rattles its shutters, snow buries it in silence, yet it endures. Seasons pass, generations fade, but the house persists, as though it has sworn the same oath as the family it shelters: to remain, to conceal, to preserve. Within its walls, meals continue as they always have. At dusk, the family gathers. Candles glow against sagging beams, casting light across faces that bear the shape of ancestors long gone. Their heads incline in silence, lips moving with prayers that predate memory. The cellar waits below, its air heavy with centuries of devotion. The table is already scarred with fresh lines, the hooks already swaying with new offerings. Children, wide-eyed and solemn, are guided to their places. Their first portions are placed in their hands. Some tremble, some resist, but all partake in the end. The ritual seals them, binds them, turns them from children of the world above into children of the feast. Their tears salt the offering. Their bloodline grows heavier with obligation. The elders watch, their eyes clouded with both pride and burden. They see in the trembling hands of the young the same motions they once made, the same fear swallowed in silence, the same binding act that turned them from the frightened to the faithful. Nothing has broken, nothing has faltered. The feast is eternal. Outsiders still vanish. a traveler who knocks for water on a hot day, a weary motorist whose engine dies on the wrong stretch of road, a neighbor who grows too curious about the smoke or the smell. They are welcomed as guests, as honored company. They are offered bread, stew, warmth. They smile at the kindness, never knowing the true cost. By morning, they are gone. Their names fade into rumor, their faces blur into memory. But within the cellar, their presence endures, preserved in jars, buried in soil, or carried forward in blood and bone. They become part of the lineage, unwilling heirs to the ritual that has spanned centuries. The valley whispers sometimes, but never loudly enough. People suspect, but suspicion is a frail weapon. Fear is stronger. And the family knows well how to feed fear with charm, with silence, with the careful mask of normalcy. Neighbors wave at them in passing, never knowing the truth. The children of the valley sing rhymes about the homestead, warnings whispered at dusk. Do not linger by its fence. Do not answer its windows. Do not follow its smoke. Parents dismiss the songs as childish fancy, but the children repeat them anyway. They do not know why, only that it feels true. Visitors, strangers, the curious, they accept invitations, never realizing the cost. The family knows how to smile, how to speak gently, how to make the hearth glow with warmth that conceals the chill of the cellar below. Outsiders never sense the weight of eyes upon them, never see how carefully they are being measured. By the time they understand, it is too late. And deep within the cellar, the bones of centuries echo. The shelves groan beneath the weight of jars filled long before the children of today were born. The hooks sway with offerings both fresh and ancient, a rhythm as steady as heartbeat. The table bears new scars beside the old, each line another entry in the scripture of hunger. The pits grow deeper, layer upon layer of remains pressed into the soil until the ground itself seems to breathe. Some say, if you listen closely in the cellar, you can hear voices in the stone. Whispers that rise with the damp air, murmurs of the consumed, promises of endurance. The children are told these whispers are blessings. They believe because belief is survival. The cellar is not silent. It hums with centuries of hunger, with the ceaseless echo of the endless feast. The family endures. No famine is needed now, no drought, no storm, no failure of crops. The feast is not survival, it is identity. The family does not continue because it must. It continues because it knows nothing else. To abandon the ritual would be to abandon themselves. The elders remind the young. Others die, but we endure. Outsiders are fleeting, neighbors fade. But the family persists, unbroken, carried forward in blood, in flesh, in silence. The house endures with them. Its walls sag but do not fail. Its cellar grows heavier but does not collapse. The house, like the family, has been shaped by hunger until it has become something beyond wood and stone. It is an accomplice, a vessel, a guardian of tradition. It has witnessed every offering, heard every prayer, held every scream. It does not forget. And so the Cannibal homestead remains. It remains through famine and feast, through suspicion and silence, through centuries of hunger and centuries of deception. It remains in the stories children whisper, in the smoke neighbors glance at and then look away from, in the ledger of disappearances that grows longer than memory. It remains because the family remains. And the family remains because the feast is eternal.